Hey everybody. What you're seeing right now, is the earliest surviving film adaptation, an 1896 version of Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle. Comprised of 6 very short films, it feels a bit strange to call what we're seeing here Rip Van Winkle, right? A story originally about the passage of time and the impact of the Revolutionary War has been reduced to a bunch of clips of people in the woods. There's not much more to it. And the ending is the most peculiar part. In the final short, titled Rip Passing Over the Hill, we see the protagonist, now 20 years in the future, stand up, climb a small hill, and look out for a minute. Presumably, he's looking at the world and how it's changed in 20 years' time. But we don't get to see that. The film cuts to black and that's it. I say it feels strange to call this work, which bears little resemblance to Rip Van Winkle, a proper adaptation. But, of course, we have to remember that this was made at the infancy of cinema, a time when creating the illusion of motion through still frames was new, when people recoiled in their seats when they saw movie trains coming at them. And maybe this film was all anybody needed. Looking at Rip, older now, seeing a world unlike the one he knew, was enough for things to be authentic. For the film to not just feel like its source material, but also to work as a more visceral, lifelike version of it. I can't help but imagine what it was like to see this movie in 1896, and to have this great sense that you know how it feels to be Rip Van Winkle in that moment. And no, we can't see what he's seeing, but we have this sense, like whatever he's looking at, it's real. It's really there. When I think about this film from 120 years ago, I'm reminded of what it was like to be a 14-year-old who just found out that the first season of Avatar would be adapted into a feature-length film. Even then, I knew that animation and live-action cinema were both deeply subjective mediums. Cinematography, lighting, special effects, acting, choreography, these are deliberate tools that artists have at their disposal. When we watch live-action movies, what we see is no more objective or honest than what we see in animation. Still though, it's one thing to say that out loud and know that it's true. It's another thing to really believe it on an emotional level. And when I learned that an Avatar movie was coming, I was kind of excited. Not just because Avatar was and is one of my favorite shows ever, but also because now this wasn't just gonna be a bunch of drawings on a screen. It would be the genuine article. Aang, a full-fledged 3-dimensional person, doing actual airbending in an environment that looks real enough for me to walk around in it. And don't get me wrong, I expected to always love the original show more than whatever this movie would be. But it was gonna be fun to walk into a theater and be convinced for a few hours that I was looking at Avatar itself. What's more, I think that M. Night Shyamalan was totally aware of what his audience wanted out of this movie, aware of their desire to see Avatar, but in real life. In fact, it kinda seems like he took this sentiment a little too far. Within his film, making Avatar feel real meant making it more gritty and hardcore, whatever that means. Unlike the first season, which runs the gamut from bright and filled with laughter to emotional and intense, the film hits one tone from the start and hits it hard. It's earnest and dark. The sets are more mundane and less colorful now. Bending is no longer powerful and expressive in this movie. Now it has very little power and looks unexceptional. The acting is stark and intense.
They prey on the weakest towns and villages. We should go visit some of these towns, Aang.
I need to tell you something.
What is it, Aang?
I ran away before they trained me to be the Avatar.
None of these aspects are, by themselves, more realistic than the original show was. But when we look at all these things together, we can get a sense for how the movie is trying to be more grounded than its source material is. Less cartoony, less big, less fantasy-like. And on some level, we might take this aesthetic goal to be simple, something that's hard to achieve but easy to understand. What should The Last Airbender do if it wants to be a more real version of Avatar? I don't know, it should be a lot like the original Avatar. Follow the same plot, convey the same ideas, have the same characters. But, of course, it should be live action and a lot more lifelike. It's not rocket science, right? But what I love about The Last Airbender is that it tells us none of this stuff is simple at all. No, the process of adapting one text into another and producing something that makes sense, that feels like its source material, that feels real, it's super complicated and tricky, and there's a whole bunch of assumptions we put into it. Through its failure, through its ineptitude and lack of cohesion, The Last Airbender questions those assumptions and asks, what's necessary for a work to be in adaptation? So what do I mean by assumptions, right? What am I talking about? Well, I think one of the biggest assumptions we make as we enter any adaptation is that there's a continuity between the characters in the source material and those in the adaptation. Look at the way I spoke about Rip Van Winkle earlier on. I said the words Rip Van Winkle, and it probably felt clear what I was referring to. Even as the Rip from the film, a silent actor who does very few things, is quite different from the Rip from the story, who does stuff like live in a society and talk to people, it wasn't much of a problem, because either way, it's Rip, right? The character we know and love, I guess. And in a few interesting ways, The Last Airbender comes in to challenge this assumption of continuity. For one thing, the characters in this movie aren't just different from those in the source material, they also reject the basic elements that go into those characters. Aang's most defining feature in Avatar was his playfulness and love of lighthearted fun. But in The Last Airbender, he isn't an incurable prankster. He doesn't take joy in things. He's just worried and nervous and somber.
Some of the great monks can meditate for 4 days.
Sokka in the original show is kinda complicated. He's insecure about his modest upbringing. He thinks he's right all the time, but he's willing to learn and change. He's a bit of a grump too, and I love him. But in the film, the character is only stern and kinda angry.
I'm sorry. Hey, I'm sorry.
Kinda too angry sometimes. And essentially, this is true of every character. They're not diverse or deep. They are all serious at almost every moment. And looking at this sea of homogeneous figures, it's hard to think that when we talk about these characters, we're also talking about those characters. They don't feel the same anymore. And what's a bit cool is that The Last Airbender seems to lean into this sense of non-continuity, and it does so through its use of names. See, adaptations are usually hard to talk about in a clean way. If you want to refer to the ways that characters in adaptations differ from or conform to the characters in their source material, you're constantly forced to use language that makes it clear what you're talking about. The movie Rip Van Winkle does this, where the story Rip Van Winkle does that. This demand is cumbersome, and besides, it feels unnatural. As I've already said, when we experience adaptations, we kinda just want to imagine that there is no distinction between these characters, that they are two figures playing the same part. But in a strange gesture, The Last Airbender makes its characters, weirdly easy to talk about. When I speak about the movie, I don't have to make it clear if I'm referring to show Aang or film Aang, because as it turns out, there is no film Aang. This guy's name is Aang.
So, are you the Avatar, Aang?
There is no Sokka, only Sokka.
Sokka, don't.
No Iroh, only Iroh.
My name is Iroh, and you have my word.
Here, the film suggests that the process through which we associate this character with this one is ultimately arbitrary and artificial. The person we're watching here is a mutant, who bears a similar face to Aang, but who is not Aang, and who constantly reminds us of this fact. To put it simply, there is no connection anymore. We can't even really pretend there is one. So, another main assumption we usually bring into adaptations is that there exists some essence to the source material that can be maintained in the adaptation. When we look at the movie Rip Van Winkle, we might say something like this. Sure, the film is drastically different from the story, but it still captures the most crucial part of it. This moment of looking out and not having access to how the world works anymore, that's Rip Van Winkle in a nutshell, right? Fundamentally, this assumption implies that there are aspects of texts that are more important than other aspects. There are things that give a text its meaning and things that kinda don't, and a good adaptation is able to figure out which is which. And before I talk about The Last Airbender, I think it's important to discuss the original show for a minute. Because even though Avatar is a show that's not necessarily good because of its big, high-concept themes, the show still says something. It still surrounds an idea. In short, the idea is that we have egos. We have specific perspectives and beliefs through which we see our experiences, and we want the world to be reflective of those beliefs. More than that, though, the show suggests that this egoism is a bad thing. More often than not, the impulse to express our vision is a destructive and distorting one, something we have to see past if we want to get better and make the world better. You can see this idea pop up when we start talking about the premise of the show. The Fire Nation is bent on increasing its power, spreading itself throughout the world. It's a state that firmly believes in its own supremacy, and it acts accordingly. But because of this belief, the Fire Nation destroys the world, genocides one people and enslaves another. And so we see here a story about an ego, in this case a national ego, whose desire to reproduce itself and its values creates incredibly negative results. But this idea is far more important to the show than a discussion of one arc might suggest. In fact, it's essentially the premise of every single episode. I'm not going to go in depth through all the examples here because it's really not that important to the video, but look at Jet, the Northern Air Temple, the Fortune Teller, the Waterbending Master, the Deserter, and many more episodes. You'll find that they're all about a character who believes something strongly.
But what about the people in the town? Won't they get wiped out too?
Look, Duke, that's the price of ridding this area of the Fire Nation.
And about discovering that this belief, whatever it is harmful.
Sokka, you fool! We could have freed this valley! Who would be free? Everyone would be dead.
They're about the failure of a fixed vision of the self to positively interact with the world. And when we look at The Last Airbender, what we find is a film that doesn't just not carry with it this emotional and thematic center, but which also fails to say anything or make any sense on a conceptual level, even when it feels like it could. Let's look at one of the most infamous scenes from the movie, the one that's adapting the episode Imprisoned.
Those who could not bend were allowed to live in peace, if we were imprisoned.
Look, he even says the word. The original episode can easily be read within the framework I laid down. It's a story that posits that oppression isn't just a material reality, but also a psychological one. The Fire Nation, who seeks to subjugate Earthbenders, is only able to do so by convincing them, falsely, that they are powerless.
Look at these blank, hopeless faces. Their spirits were broken a long time ago.
And they need to break out of that role in order to gain their freedom.
Thank you for helping me find my courage, Katara of the Water Tribe.
There's a bit of a double meaning, you see. They're imprisoned on a boat, but also inside of their heads. Yeah. But unlike this episode, in The Last Airbender, we're given no real idea at all why these people are sitting in this camp. They're not on a ship in this scene. They know they're able to earthbend. This guy says they were defeated by metal machines before.
And they sent their machines. Huge machines made of metal. There was nothing we could do.
But it seems like those machines are nowhere to be found. No one talks about them coming back, at least. And what's more, we don't have a picture of the psychological oppressions the Earthbenders endure. I don't know why they feel disempowered here in the first place. And because of all that, this scene, which has a recognizable connection to the original show, fails to carry any of its actual meaning. These characters were in a bad spot that they didn't have to be in. They decided to get out of it, and they succeeded without much trouble. If it comes together to say anything, it's that liberation is easy and that you probably should have done it already. And that just seems to go against the entire premise of both the show and the film. These works stipulate that saving the day is pretty hard to do and sometimes requires a hero. Let's look at another example, a moment toward the end of the movie adapting Zhao's death scene. Again, in the original show, Zhao is the embodiment of an ego that seeks only to reproduce itself. He's prideful and arrogant, and so clouded by his desires that he finds tremendous joy in the idea that his will could destroy a god.
The Fire Nation will for generations tell stories about the great Zhao who darkened the moon. They will call me Zhao the Conqueror, Zhao the Moon Slayer.
And in his final scene in the show, one thing is made totally clear. This sort of egoism isn't just destructive of the world, but also of the self. As the ocean spirit punishes him for his crimes against nature, he dies because he won't take Zuko's hand, except that mercy and weakness can be good things. And when we look at the reproduction in The Last Airbender, we find, once again, that it tries to mean as little as possible. Since the ocean spirit no longer plays much of a part in this film, Zhao is killed by 4 anonymous waterbenders who have unclear motivations. Zuko walks away before Zhao's killed, so his death can't indicate anything about Zuko's character or the way he feels. And the cherry on the sundae of this scene is that before Zuko and Iroh leave, Iroh says this:
You stand alone. And that has always been your great mistake.
This line might just be the most vacuous statement I've ever heard in any movie. For one thing, neither Avatar nor The Last Airbender are focused on the importance of cooperation over individualism. It's a theme that presents itself a little bit in the original show, but which goes totally unexplored in the film. But more importantly, Iroh's line just isn't true. Zhao constantly gets people to work with him. In fact, he functions as a foil for Zuko, who's a sullen loner most of the time. The Yu Yen archers, the fire sages, Iroh, yeah, the guy who says this, they're all people who Zhao enlists in his mission.
You stand alone. And that has always been your great mistake.
I don't want to shame this line too much. I mean, it's kinda just silly, isn't it? But when I watch the scene, I can't help but feel like Iroh could have said anything here. Something about Zhao's arrogance, or hubris, or about how dishonorable he is. Most lines would be able to produce more meaning and be more reflective of the source material than this line was. Let's come back to our assumption that an adaptation can or ought to maintain the essence of its source material. Thinking this, we'd watch The Last Airbender and say one of two things. Either A, you got it, you zoomed in on the right parts and made something that captured the original, or B, you didn't get it. You zoomed in on the wrong parts and produced something that didn't capture the original. But when we look at these moments of the film, places where the movie seems to reject any message or thematic structure, much less one that comes from Avatar, it doesn't feel like the movie does either of those things. Instead, it posits that its source material has no real essence, that there's nothing important in it to zoom in on, or that whatever is there can't be captured in a meaningful way. Okay, so we have this film that slowly whittles away at the basic framework we take into adaptations. The Last Airbender tells us that it doesn't have the same characters as the original work does. It tells us that it doesn't retain the essence of the original. We feel like the movie wants to be real in some sense, but what does it want to be a real version of? And we might be tempted to answer that question with one word: nothing. Ultimately, we could say that this isn't an adaptation that's concerned at all with its source material, that it's not even really an adaptation. Here's the thing though, I think that answer is wrong. I think the movie is invested in recreating the original show. Very invested. It attempts to import an enormous number of things that happen in the original show, and oftentimes it does so in really unique and terrible ways. To show you what I mean, let's make a little list of all the callbacks in this film. I hope you're all ready to discover that I'm a huge Avatar nerd, because that's about to happen in a big way. First off, we have the 2 main episodes that the film wants to center most of its energy around. The first 2-parter, where Sokka and Katara find Aang, and the 2-parter ending the first season, the Siege of the North. Then you have some of the episodes that the film wants to show us little bits of. I already mentioned Imprisoned, but there are more. Katara finds a waterbending scroll, a reference to the episode The Waterbending Scroll. we see some wanted posters of Aang, referencing this same event in the episode The Deserter. Now things start to get a bit messy, as the show doesn't only include episodes for a brief moment and then move on to the next, it also blends episodes together in a strange show slurry. Aang tells Zuko that he thinks they could be friends.
We could be friends, you know.
Something from the episode The Blue Spirit, but now this occurs toward the end of the film. Zuko and Zhao have a fight that is almost identical to the one they have toward the beginning of the show in the episode The Southern Air Temple, but now it happens in the climax, right before Zhao dies. One scene is particularly all over the place. It occurs at the Northern Air Temple, episode 17. It has statues from the Southern Air Temple, episode 3. Guys who look like the fire mages are there, that's from episode 8. And there's the Blue Spirit conflict with Zhao from episode 13. And all that is depicted in around 5 minutes of screen time. These constant callbacks refer directly back to things from the first season, right? When you see them, you can say, "Oh yeah, that happened. I remember that happening. This really is trying to be Avatar, isn't it?" And because of this, we can't say that the film doesn't care about the original. Rather, it just cares about it in a very weird way. Rather than seeing the source material as a set of characters or themes that can be worked into the story, The Last Airbender views the show as a series of facts and events that must be portrayed if the adaptation is to function as such. In order to produce a real-life Avatar, there needs to be as much Avatar contrived in as many places as is humanly possible. So, on one level, when we see The Last Airbender in all of this awful glory, it feels right to call the film a cautionary tale. If I had to give one bit of advice to anybody trying to make a faithful adaptation, I'd tell them to watch this movie and not follow its example. Envision your source material as a work with characters and themes that can be expressed in your work. Don't think of it as a bunch of facts that all need to be reproduced, because what you'll end up making will feel hollow. It'll neither stand as good art on its own, nor will it feel like it has a profound relationship to what you're basing it on. And, you know, I can say all that unasked for, uninformed advice, and it does seem true enough, but I can't help but feel like The Last Airbender says something else, something more important. I think the film hits on a kind of uncomfortable honesty, both with itself and with the art of adaptation. We want to think that the characters in a source material can continue to exist within an adaptation, but The Last Airbender says that's not true. Aang isn't a real person. He can't be in one work, get up, and move to another. He's limited to the text he's in, and there is no extending him into something else. So let's just call this guy Aang. What difference does it make? We want to think there's some essence to the media we watch, and that we can capture that essence by picking out the most important bits. The Last Airbender says that's not true. If Avatar was a thing that could be distilled, if it were only there to express some big idea, then why didn't it just say that idea and skip the show? No, for this film, there is no essence to capture, so why try to capture it? Let's just have the movie say almost nothing at all. Ultimately, The Last Airbender claims that everything in Avatar is equally important and unimportant to understanding it. The source material is just a list of textual facts with no center, and so the only thing the adaptation can hope to do is depict a bunch of those facts in an arbitrary order. There can't be something else to it. So Rip Van Winkle is standing on that hill, looking out. And I think I know. What he's seeing is the world 20 years in the future. That's the story I'm watching, right? The story being made real for me. But let's be honest. I have no idea what this guy is looking at. Alright, well, that was that for that video. This one took me a long old time, you know? Even the editing took forever. But I hope you liked it. It kind of feels sad that I'm not going to be talking about The Last Airbender much anymore, you know? I love talking about that movie. Anyway, now it's time for my Patreon question of the week. I got a lot of questions this time, thank you guys. AJ Reinhardt asks, who are some of your favorite YouTube channels? Do they inspire your content, or are they pretty different from what you make? I don't think it would be much of a surprise to learn the people who inspire me on YouTube. You know, ContraPoints, H-Bomber Guy, Lindsay Ellis, the Jenny Nicholson, Sean especially is a huge inspiration on my work. It's hard to explain how these people inform what I do. It's not like I try to copy them, at least consciously. I think what it comes down to is just, it's simple, you know? I think they do great work. And when you see people doing great work on the platform that you're on, you want to do work that's as good as those people. I don't think it's as much as like they literally make me make choices so much as I just want to make stuff that's as good as the stuff that they make. So that's the answer. If you want to ask a Patreon question or get access to videos early or whatever, head over to my Patreon. There's actually a bunch of new little rewards that I think personally are quite fun. So do that, you know, like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.